He was checking the forest after a storm and didn't expect anything unusual. But deep in the woods, a ranger found an abandoned observatory. When he went inside and saw what had been hidden there, he had to urgently call 911. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the forest in a state of uneasy calm. By morning, the rain clouds had thinned into pale streaks drifting east, and the wind that had torn through the valley now moved only as an occasional sigh through the treetops. For the ranger, storms like this were never just weather. They were disruptions, moments when the land shifted just enough to reveal problems that routine patrols might otherwise miss. He had been assigned the outer sector shortly after sunrise. The radio message was brief and procedural. Downed trees reported near the old service trail, a sensor that had gone silent sometime after midnight, and a general instruction to verify that no hikers or campers had been trapped by flooding or fallen debris. It was a long walk through terrain few visitors ever reached, but that was precisely why it mattered. The quiet zones were where trouble liked to hide. He had worked this forest for years. He knew the difference between a branch broken by wind and one snapped by human hands. He could tell how old a footprint was by how the soil had settled around it, and whether a trail marker had been loosened by rot or deliberately twisted free. Familiarity had bred not complacency, but a kind of instinctive awareness. When something felt wrong, it usually was. The first part of the patrol was uneventful. The main trail showed the expected signs of the storm: leaves plastered to the ground, shallow rivulets carved into the dirt, one large pine uprooted and lying parallel to the path. He marked the obstruction for later removal and moved on, following a narrower route used mostly by staff rather than visitors. This path wound deeper into the forest, away from scenic overlooks and informational signs, toward land that existed more for conservation than recreation. It was there that he noticed the tire tracks. They were faint, half softened by rain, but unmistakable once he saw them. Two parallel impressions cutting across the trail, pressed into soil that should never have felt a vehicle's weight. No authorized maintenance truck had been scheduled for this sector, and even if one had, it would have left fresher, more obvious damage. These tracks were older, perhaps a few days, but still recent enough to raise concern. He knelt to examine them more closely, fingers brushing the edge of the compressed earth. The tread pattern was unusual, not what he typically saw on parked vehicles. He straightened slowly, scanning the surrounding trees. Nothing obvious stood out, yet the feeling that had followed him all morning tightened in his chest. He reported the tracks over the radio, noting their approximate direction. Protocol suggested he should continue his assigned route, but another detail caught his eye before he could move on. A length of rope hung loosely from a low branch several yards off the trail, darkened by moisture but otherwise intact. It had been cut cleanly at one end, not frayed or torn. Nearby, tangled in wet undergrowth, lay a scrap of heavy plastic sheeting, the kind used for construction rather than camping. Individually, these things might have meant nothing. Together, they suggested activity that did not belong here. He hesitated. Deviating from the patrol route without explicit instruction was discouraged, but the forest was not a place where rigid adherence to procedure always made sense. If someone had driven into this sector and left behind equipment, there was a chance they were still nearby, injured or otherwise in need of help. There was also the less charitable possibility that someone was doing something they did not want discovered. He keyed the radio again, informed dispatch that he was making a brief detour to investigate potential unauthorized access, and began following the subtle signs leading away from the trail. The forest thickened quickly. Ferns and low shrubs crowded his legs, and fallen branches forced him to slow his pace. As he moved deeper, the usual background sounds seemed muted. Birds were present, but fewer than expected, and the constant rustle of small animals was oddly absent. It was not silence exactly, but a subdued stillness, as though the land itself were holding its breath. After nearly 20 minutes of careful progress, he caught sight of something that made him stop. At first, it was only a curve of dull metal glimpsed through the leaves, a shape that did not belong among trunks and vines. He shifted position, stepping sideways to get a clearer view, and felt a jolt of disbelief as more of it came into focus. A dome. It rose from the ground like the back of some buried animal, its surface mottled with rust and streaked with moss. Thick vines clung to its sides, and saplings had grown up around its base, their roots pressing against what appeared to be an old concrete foundation. The structure was large, unmistakably artificial, and yet so thoroughly swallowed by the forest that it could be missed by anyone not looking directly at it. He stood there for a long moment, simply staring. There was no record of any structure in this area. He was certain of that. The park's archives were not perfect, but something of this size and permanence should have left a paper trail. Research stations, lookout towers, even abandoned maintenance sheds were documented, if only as historical footnotes. This, however, was something else entirely. He approached cautiously, circling the structure at a distance. The dome was attached to a low building, rectangular and squat, its walls stained by decades of weather. No signage remained. If there had ever been identifying plaques or warning notices, they had been removed long ago. The only markings were scars where bolts or screws had once held something in place. The ground around the building told its own story. Older signs of human presence lay half buried beneath leaves. The remains of a fire pit, rusted cans collapsed into themselves, fragments of glass smoothed by time. But layered over these were newer disturbances. The soil near the back wall showed impressions that matched the tire tracks he had seen earlier. Someone had been here recently, parking close enough to unload or load something heavy. He checked his map again, more out of habit than hope. The screen remained blank of any reference to the structure before him. A familiar unease crept in, the kind that came not from fear but from unanswered questions. The entrance was on the eastern side, partially hidden by a thicket of brush. A heavy metal door, its paint long gone, stood set into the wall. The hinges were rusted, yet the door itself sat square in its frame, not warped or hanging loose as one might expect from decades of neglect. More striking still was the area around the handle. The metal there was cleaner, smoother, as if it had been touched often enough to wear away the corrosion. He bent to examine the ground near the threshold and felt a chill run through him. An imprint in the damp soil was unmistakable, the sole of a boot, sharply defined despite the rain. It was not old. Whoever had made it could not have been gone long. He straightened slowly, every sense alert now. The forest around him seemed unchanged, but he knew how deceptive appearances could be. If someone was using this place, they might return at any moment. Protocol dictated caution. He stepped back, checked the stability of the surrounding ground, and considered calling for immediate backup. Yet another part of him, the part shaped by years of solitary patrols and quiet discoveries, urged him to gather as much information as possible before escalating. The condition of the door, the absence of warning signs, The deliberate concealment suggested that whatever this place was, it had not been abandoned in the careless way most forgotten structures were. He slipped on his gloves, retrieved his flashlight, and activated the camera on his phone to record his approach. Documentation mattered. If this turned into something larger, there needed to be a clear record of what he had found and when. The handle resisted at first, stiff with age, then moved with a low groan of metal against metal. The door did not swing open wide, but it opened enough for him to see into the darkness beyond. Cool air spilled out, carrying the faint scent of dry dust and old machinery. It was not the smell of rot or decay. It was the smell of a place that had been sealed, protected from the elements, and entered deliberately. He paused at the threshold, listening. There were no footsteps, no voices, no mechanical hum, only the distant sounds of the forest behind him. With one last glance over his shoulder, he stepped inside and pulled the door partially closed behind him, unaware that this single decision would pull him into a chain of events that would reach far beyond the boundaries of the forest he thought he knew. The door closed behind him with a muted, metallic sound that seemed louder than it should have been. For a moment, he stood still, allowing his eyes to adjust, listening for any sign that he was not alone. The air inside the structure was cool and unexpectedly dry, carrying the faint, unmistakable scent of old metal and dust rather than mold or rot. It was the smell of a place that had been shut away from rain and animals, not one that had been left open to decay. He swept the beam of his flashlight slowly across the interior. The main chamber opened wide beneath the curved ceiling of the dome, its height far greater than he had anticipated from the outside. The space felt deliberate, engineered. Thick metal ribs arched overhead, converging toward the center where a circular mechanism sat embedded in the floor. Whatever instrument had once stood there was gone, removed so completely that only mounting bolts and faint outlines in the dust remained. What struck him immediately was the absence of chaos. There were no shattered glass panels, no graffiti, no piles of trash dragged in by bored teenagers or scavengers. The floor was dusty, yes, but the dust lay undisturbed in broad, even layers. No footprints crossed it except for his own, now carefully placed. If vandals had ever found this place, they had left no trace. He moved deeper into the room, careful to keep his steps measured. Along the walls ran cable conduits, most of them empty. Where wires had once been, there were clean cuts, ends capped or tucked away. This was not the work of someone ripping equipment out in a hurry. It was the mark of dismantling, done with time, tools, and a plan. He paused near the center of the chamber, angling the light upward. The inner surface of the dome bore scars where mechanisms had been removed. Faint, circular impressions marked where the rotation system for the dome's opening must once have been. He could imagine it now, years or decades ago, turning smoothly to expose the sky above. Whatever purpose it had served, that era was long over. Yet the building did not feel abandoned in the usual sense. There was no sense of collapse or neglect, only of absence. As if someone had come through and taken away everything they deemed important, leaving behind a shell that was never meant to be used again, but also never meant to be found. He followed the wall clockwise, scanning for signs of instability. The concrete floor was solid underfoot, though stained in places where water had once seeped in. Those stains were old, their edges softened by time. Recent moisture had not reached this far inside. The structure, whatever its age, was still holding. Near one wall stood a long metal table, and its surface bare except for a thin layer of dust. The outline of objects could be seen where something had rested for years before being removed. Rectangular shapes, perhaps equipment cases or document boxes. The dust around them was undisturbed, suggesting they had been taken away all at once, not piecemeal. He crouched to inspect one corner more closely and noticed a detail that tightened his focus. On the wall above the table were two small holes, evenly spaced, with faint discoloration around them. A plaque had once been mounted there. The plaque was gone, and someone had taken the trouble to fill or grind down whatever markings might have identified it. It was not vandalism. It was erasure. The realization followed him as he moved on. In another section of the room, he found a storage crate pushed against the wall, its stenciled markings scratched out, not painted over, but deliberately scraped until only ghostly outlines remained. Whoever had done this wanted to remove names, not merely hide them. A narrow stairwell led down from the main chamber, partially concealed behind a structural support. He approached it cautiously, testing each step before putting his weight down. The stairs were metal, bolted securely to the wall, and though rusted, they felt stable enough. The sound of his boots echoed faintly as he descended, the noise swallowed quickly by the thick walls. The lower level was divided into smaller rooms, their doors arranged along a central corridor. Some stood open, others were closed. Here, too, the atmosphere was not one of neglect, but of controlled emptiness. Shelves lined the walls of one room, all of them bare. Another contained a workbench with no tools, only faint outlines where instruments had once been laid out in careful order. He ran his gloved hand lightly over the bench, disturbing the dust just enough to confirm his suspicion. The absence of clutter was as telling as any presence might have been. No one had simply walked away from this place. It had been stripped. In the far corner of the corridor, he found something that did not fit with the rest. A set of bolts along the doorframe of one room gleamed faintly in the beam of his flashlight. They were not new, but they were newer than the surrounding metal. The door itself opened smoothly, without the protest of rusted hinges. Inside was a small service room, empty save for a few old brackets fixed to the walls. At first glance it seemed no different from the others, but as he stepped inside he noticed that the floor here was cleaner. Not spotless, but cleaner, as if it had been swept more recently, or at least shielded from the gradual accumulation of dust that coated everything else. He backed out, heart beating a little faster now, and continued down the corridor. Another door stood at the very end, narrower than the rest, its surface unmarked. There was no sign indicating its purpose. No handle, just a recessed grip and a simple latch. He hesitated. Every instinct he had told him that this door mattered. The pattern of the place pointed toward intentional design and intentional concealment, and this room felt like the end point of that design. He tested the latch. It opened easily, silently. The space beyond was dark, but unlike the other rooms it smelled faintly different, not of oil or metal, but of fabric, of something organic, something that did not belong among stripped machinery and empty shelves. He stopped just inside the threshold and raised the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness and fell upon shapes that made no sense in this context, soft edges where there should have been hard ones, colors muted by dust, but unmistakably human. Against the wall sat a row of backpacks. They were small, clearly not meant for adults. Their straps lay neatly folded, as if someone had taken care to arrange them. Beside them were cardboard boxes, taped shut, stacked with an order that mirrored the careful removal of equipment elsewhere in the building. For a moment, he simply stood there, unable to reconcile what he was seeing with everything that had come before. This place, whatever its original purpose, had become something else entirely. A storage site, not for instruments or records, but for personal belongings that should never have been separated from their owners. He stepped closer, the beam of light moving from one backpack to the next. They were worn, some faded, some marked with childish patches or pen scribbles. These were not props or discarded junk. They were used, loved even. A weight settled in his chest as the implications began to take shape. Children did not come this deep into the forest by accident. And their things did not end up hidden in sealed rooms of forgotten structures unless someone had put them there. He resisted the urge to touch anything, forcing himself to remain methodical. He raised the camera again and documented the room from the doorway, capturing the arrangement, the condition, the unsettling neatness. The training drilled into him over years took over, anchoring him even as his thoughts raced. He stepped back out into the corridor, closed the door gently, and stood there in the dim light of the lower level. The building was no longer just an anomaly on the map. It was a crime scene, whether officially recognized as one or not. He knew now that he could not simply report this as an abandoned structure. Whatever had happened here reached beyond his authority as a ranger. Yet he also understood that how he handled the next steps would determine whether the truth came out at all. He keyed his radio and spoke calmly, keeping his voice level despite the tension coiled beneath it. He reported the discovery of personal belongings that appeared to belong to minors and requested law enforcement support. He did not speculate, did not draw conclusions aloud. Facts would speak for themselves if they were preserved. As he waited for a response, he glanced once more toward the narrow door at the end of the corridor. The stillness of the place pressed in on him, heavy with secrets that had been locked away for years. Above him, unseen, the forest continued its quiet existence, unaware that beneath its roots a long-buried story had just begun to surface. He remained standing in the corridor for several long moments after lowering the radio, listening to the faint static that followed his transmission. The dispatcher acknowledged the message, her voice professional and restrained, promising to relay the information to the local sheriff's office and to send support as soon as units were available. There were no questions, no commentary. The neutrality of the response did little to ease the heaviness that had settled in his chest. Until help arrived, the responsibility remained his. He turned back toward the narrow door at the end of the corridor. The instinct to rush in and start examining everything more closely had to be suppressed. He had seen enough to know that whatever lay behind that door was no longer just a matter of curiosity or routine patrol. It demanded care. Any careless movement could destroy something that might later matter more than he could yet understand. He re-entered the room slowly, stopping just inside the doorway. The air was still, undisturbed by drafts. Dust motes drifted lazily through the beam of his flashlight, sparkling for a moment before settling again. Nothing in the room suggested recent disturbance, yet the impression of deliberate order was unmistakable. He began by documenting the scene thoroughly. The camera captured wide shots of the room, the way the backpacks leaned against the wall, the spacing between them, the precise placement of the boxes. Then he moved closer, careful to avoid touching anything, and took photographs of individual items from multiple angles. The straps, the zippers, the worn fabric edges, details that could not be recreated once disturbed. The backpacks varied in size and color. Some were small enough for a child barely old enough for school, others larger, perhaps meant for an older student. One had a faded cartoon character stitched onto the front pocket. Another bore the faint outline of a name written in marker, now nearly illegible with age. These were not generic items bought in bulk. Each one told a quiet, personal story. He crouched to examine the first box, reading the labels on its side. There were no shipping marks, no addresses, nothing to indicate transport through any official channel, just plain cardboard, sealed carefully with tape that had yellowed and cracked over time. He photographed the tape, the seams, the way the box had been closed. Whoever had sealed it had done so methodically, as if expecting it to remain unopened for a long time. With gloved hands, he gently lifted the lid of the first box. Inside were neatly folded clothes. A child's jacket lay on top, its fabric stiff but intact. Beneath it were shirts, a scarf, a pair of small shoes placed side by side with their laces tucked in. There was no dirt ground into the fabric, no evidence of rough handling. Everything had been cleaned before being stored, or at least protected from the grime one would expect in a forgotten building. He swallowed hard. The realization pressed in on him with a clarity that made his throat tighten. These were not abandoned belongings left behind by kids trespassing or playing a reckless game. These were possessions that had been deliberately collected and preserved. He continued documenting, opening a second box and then a third. Each contained similar items, each arranged with the same care. In one box he found a stack of notebooks, their covers worn, pages filled with childish handwriting and drawings. He did not open them fully, but he photographed the covers, noting names and dates where they appeared. The years varied, but all fell within a narrow span of time. As he worked, fragments of memory surfaced unbidden. Faces from old missing persons bulletins pinned to station boards years ago. Names he had read and forgotten. Stories that had circulated briefly before fading from public attention. At the time, they had seemed distant. Tragedies that belonged to other families, other towns. Now, standing in this hidden room, they felt uncomfortably close. He forced himself to remain focused. Emotional reactions could wait. Evidence could not. He stepped back and scanned the room again, looking not just at what was present but at how it was arranged. The boxes were grouped by size. The backpacks were aligned as if someone had taken the time to make them look orderly, perhaps even respectful. This was not the chaotic hoard of a thief or the careless stash of someone in a hurry. It was a collection maintained over time. He closed the boxes carefully and sealed them again as best he could without adding tape or altering their condition. He wanted the scene to remain as untouched as possible until trained investigators arrived. Then he stepped back out into the corridor and closed the door, marking it discreetly with a strip of bright tape from his kit. A simple visual indicator, nothing that would draw attention from outside, but enough to show that the room had been identified and secured. While he waited, he continued his examination of the lower level, now with a sharper eye. He looked for anything that might explain how the belongings had come to be here. Signs of habitation, perhaps. A bed, discarded food, makeshift living quarters. But there was nothing of the sort. No blankets, no clothing that would fit an adult, no personal items unrelated to children. Whoever had used this space had not lived here. That absence troubled him as much as the discovery itself. It suggested intent, purpose. He noticed footprints in the dust near the doorway of the storage room, different from his own, larger. He photographed them carefully, measuring their length against a small ruler from his kit. The pattern was distinct, not something commonly seen on park-issued boots. Another piece of the puzzle, small but potentially significant. Time passed slowly. Every sound echoed in his awareness, even the distant creak of metal as the building adjusted to temperature changes. Eventually, he heard voices above, muffled but unmistakable. The sound of the main door opening. Footsteps. He climbed the stairs to meet them. The first to enter was a local deputy, followed by another ranger from a neighboring sector. Their expressions shifted as soon as he began to explain what he had found. Skepticism gave way to concern, and then to something quieter, heavier. He led them down to the lower level, stopping at the sealed door. He explained what he had seen without embellishment, sticking to facts. The deputy nodded, radioed for additional units, and made a brief call to request a forensic team. The procedure was familiar, almost routine, but the context made it feel anything but. When the door was opened again, this time with witnesses present, the reaction was immediate. The deputy swore under his breath. The other ranger went very still, his face pale. The forensic team arrived within the hour. They moved through the building with practiced efficiency, cordoning off areas, setting up lights, donning gloves and boot covers. The quiet order of the operation contrasted sharply with the nature of the discovery, creating a surreal atmosphere that made the ranger feel slightly detached, as though he were watching events unfold from a distance. As the investigators worked, one of them called out softly, drawing attention to a detail he had not yet noticed. On the sleeve of one jacket was a small plastic tag, partially hidden by the fold of the fabric. It was not a store tag. It was rigid, rectangular, and fastened in a way that immediately triggered recognition. Evidence tag. The ranger felt a cold ripple move through him. He leaned closer, careful not to interfere, and examined the tag as the investigator held it up to the light. A printed number ran along its surface, accompanied by a barcode. The format was unmistakable. He had seen countless variations during joint operations with law enforcement over the years. This was how evidence was labeled, yet nothing about the situation made sense. This was not an official evidence locker. This was a hidden room in an unregistered structure deep in the forest. The presence of such a tag raised more questions than it answered. The deputy ordered the tag photographed and documented. A check was run through the local system. The result came back quickly and conclusively. No match. They tried again, expanding the search parameters, checking older records, archived cases. Still nothing. The number did not exist in any accessible database. A quiet unease spread through the room. The investigators exchanged looks, their professionalism intact but strained. Evidence tags did not simply appear without origin. They were issued, tracked, logged. If this one had no record, it meant either that it had been fabricated with alarming accuracy or that its record had been removed. The ranger stood back, watching, his thoughts racing. The implications were unsettling. If these items had once been part of an official investigation, how had they ended up here? And why had they been hidden so carefully, rather than destroyed? As the team continued their work, cataloging each item and preparing them for transport, he felt a growing certainty that this discovery was only the surface of something far larger. The forest had concealed many things over the years, but this was different. This was not nature reclaiming human space. This was human effort expended to bury a truth. When the boxes were finally sealed and carried out, when the backpacks were tagged and placed into evidence bags, the room felt strangely empty. Stripped once again, this time by people trying to restore order rather than erase it. He followed the procession up the stairs and out into the daylight. The forest greeted them with the same quiet indifference it always had, sunlight filtering through leaves, birds resuming their calls. From the outside, nothing had changed, but he knew better now. Beneath that calm surface lay a story that had waited a long time to be found, and it had chosen him to uncover it. The building emptied gradually as the forensic team finished their work, each sealed container carried out with the careful gravity reserved for things that could not be replaced. When the last evidence box was loaded into the vehicle and the doors were closed, a peculiar stillness settled over the clearing again. The dome stood unchanged, silent, as if it had already withdrawn back into the forest's memory. The ranger remained near the entrance, watching the cars pull away one by one, aware that the most unsettling part of the discovery had not been removed with the backpacks and boxes. It stayed with him in the form of that small plastic tag. The image of it replayed in his mind with uncomfortable clarity. The rigid texture, the precise printing, the way it had been attached to the jacket sleeve. He had seen thousands of tags over the years in one form or another. Evidence moved through systems, passed between hands, logged and relogged, always leaving a trace. Even when cases went cold, even when records were buried deep in archives, the tags themselves remained part of a chain that could, at least in theory, be followed backward. But this one led nowhere. Later that afternoon, after the site had been formally secured and the building locked under temporary authority, he was asked to give a full statement. He sat in the back of a patrol vehicle, the door open to let in air, while a deputy recorded his account. He described the sequence of events carefully, beginning with the storm, the patrol, the tracks, and the discovery of the structure. He spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing precision over speculation. When he reached the point where the evidence tag had been found, the deputy stopped riding and looked up. "Are you sure it was an official tag?" he asked. The ranger met his gaze. "I've seen enough of them to know the difference." The deputy nodded but did not comment further. He finished the report, thanked him, and drove off. By the time the ranger returned to his station, the forest was already slipping back into evening. He tried to put the day out of his mind, but the questions would not loosen their grip. That night, long after he should have been sleeping, he sat at his kitchen table with his laptop open, scrolling through public records and old news articles. He searched for missing children cases in the surrounding counties, narrowing the time frame based on the dates he had glimpsed on the notebooks and clothing. Names appeared and disappeared from the screen, each one accompanied by a grainy photograph and a brief summary that ended too often with the same phrase: "Investigation ongoing, no new leads." The next morning, he requested access to the departmental database to check the number on the tag himself. Officially, the task belonged to law enforcement, not to a ranger, but his role as the discoverer of the site gave him enough justification to ask. The response came back several hours later, impersonal and definitive. The number did not exist in any current or archived record. He stared at the screen, feeling a familiar frustration build. Databases were imperfect, but they were not arbitrary. For a number to be completely absent suggested that it had never been entered or that it had been removed. The first possibility implied fabrication. The second implied intent. He drove to the county office that afternoon and spoke with a records clerk he had known for years. She was careful, her tone neutral, but she confirmed what he already suspected. Old cases from the late 90s and early 2000s had been transferred between systems multiple times. Some records had been scanned. Others had not. A small percentage had been marked as lost due to damage or administrative error. Fires, floods, relocations, the usual explanations. "What about evidence logs?" he asked. She hesitated before answering. "Same story," she said. "Most of them were digitized later. Not everything made the transition cleanly." He thanked her and left, his thoughts heavier than before. That explanation accounted for gaps, but not for a physical tag attached to an item that had clearly been preserved somewhere outside official storage. Evidence did not wander off on its own. By late afternoon, he had made up his mind. There was someone who might recognize the tag even if the database did not. Someone who had worked with physical evidence before everything became abstracted into screens and file numbers. The man lived in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of a neighboring town, far enough away to discourage casual visits. He had retired nearly 15 years earlier, after a long career as a forensic technician and later an archival supervisor for the regional police department. The ranger had met him only once, briefly, during a joint training exercise long ago, but his name had stayed with him. People who spent their lives organizing the past tended to remember details others forgot. The house was modest, well kept, with a narrow porch and a line of trimmed hedges. When the ranger knocked, it took a few moments before the door opened. The man who answered was thinner than the ranger remembered, his hair almost entirely gray, his posture slightly stooped. His eyes, however, were sharp. "Yes," he said. The ranger introduced himself and explained, in general terms, why he was there. He did not mention the forest or the observatory right away. He asked instead whether the man would be willing to look at a photograph. Suspicion flickered briefly across the older man's face, but curiosity won out. He stepped aside and let the ranger into the house. The interior smelled faintly of paper and old wood. Shelves lined the walls of the living room, filled with binders and books. It was clear that retirement had not diminished the man's habit of keeping records. The ranger took out his phone and pulled up the photograph of the evidence tag. He handed it over without commentary and waited. The older man studied the image in silence. At first his expression was neutral, but as his eyes traced the number and the shape of the tag, something changed. His jaw tightened. He looked up sharply. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The ranger told him, briefly and carefully. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He described only what had been found and where. The man listened without interruption, then handed the phone back and leaned heavily against the table behind him. "That's real," he said, "or it was." The words landed with quiet force. He explained that the tag format was an older one, used before the full consolidation of evidence tracking systems. Back then, tags were printed locally, numbered according to internal protocols that varied by department. The barcode style, the font, even the plastic itself all pointed to a specific period. "But the number should still exist," the ranger said, "even if the case is old." The older man nodded slowly. "It should, unless it was removed." He spoke reluctantly after that, choosing his words with care. In the late 90s, he said, there had been problems during the transition to digital records. Some evidence had been misplaced. Some records had been corrupted. Officially, these issues were attributed to technical failures. Unofficially, there were rumors. "What kind of rumors?" the ranger asked. The man sighed. "That certain items were being taken out of circulation. Not whole cases, just pieces. Things that made cases harder to close." The ranger felt a chill. "Children's belongings?" The older man did not answer immediately. He looked away, his gaze settling on a stack of old binders across the room. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. "Sometimes." The ranger asked who would have had the authority to do such a thing. The man shook his head. "Too many people, if they wanted to," he said. "Evidence techs, supervisors, lead investigators. But it wouldn't have been random. Someone would have had to know which items to take and why." The conversation stretched on, moving through years of institutional memory and half-forgotten controversies. The ranger learned that there had been a fire in one of the old storage facilities, a convenient disaster that had erased the physical record of certain losses. He learned that some cases had been quietly downgraded after evidence went missing, reclassified as unsolvable due to insufficient proof. When he finally stood to leave, the older man stopped him at the door. "If that tag ended up where you found it," he said, "then someone went to a lot of trouble to keep those items safe. Or hidden. Either way, they didn't want them destroyed." The ranger drove back through the fading light with the man's words echoing in his head. The forest road seemed longer than usual, each mile marked by a growing certainty that the discovery was not an isolated anomaly. It was a fragment of a larger pattern, one that had been concealed deliberately and carefully. That night, he spread his notes across the table and began to cross-reference names from the notebooks with old case summaries. As he worked, a disturbing repetition emerged. The same investigator's name appeared again and again, attached to cases that had stalled after evidence was lost. At first, he told himself it was coincidence. Then he stopped pretending. The tag that did not exist had opened a door far more dangerous than the one he had stepped through in the forest. And now that it was open, there was no closing it again. The name stayed with him through the night, repeating itself in his thoughts with a persistence that made sleep impossible. He had closed the laptop hours earlier, yet the pattern he had uncovered refused to loosen its grip. One investigator's signature appeared too often in the margins of too many stalled cases. At first glance, it could be explained away by seniority, by experience, by the simple fact that some officers handled more complex files than others. But the longer he looked, the more the repetition felt deliberate rather than incidental. By morning, he knew that whatever came next could not be handled through ordinary channels alone. The system that should have clarified the truth had already shown its limits. Requests disappeared into bureaucratic delays. Answers came back vague or incomplete, and beneath it all lay the quiet pressure to stop digging, to let the matter be handled by people further up the chain. He reported for duty as usual, carrying himself with the same professional composure he always had. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, however, his sense of purpose had sharpened into something almost rigid. He knew that if he allowed himself to wait passively, the momentum would vanish. Evidence would be reassigned. Priorities would shift. Files would be buried under newer emergencies. The truth, once again, would recede. That morning, he was called into his supervisor's office. The conversation was polite, even cordial. He was thanked for his diligence, commended for following protocol, and informed that the matter had been escalated to the appropriate authorities. He was advised, gently but firmly, to step back and allow the investigation to proceed without further involvement from him. It was not an order, but it was close enough to one. He nodded, agreed, and left the office without argument. He understood the unspoken message. His role, officially, was finished. Unofficially, the expectation was that he would return to his routine patrols and let others decide what came next. Instead, he drove in the opposite direction. The retired archivist's house came into view again by early afternoon. This time, the visit was not about a single photograph. It was about context, history, the gaps between official explanations. The older man welcomed him in without surprise, as though he had been expecting his return. They sat at the kitchen table, sunlight slanting through the window, dust drifting lazily in the air. The ranger laid out what he had found so far, speaking openly now. He named the investigator whose signature kept appearing. He described the pattern of missing evidence, the timing, the geographic overlap. The older man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. When the ranger finished, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a long moment. "You're not wrong," he said finally, "but you're only seeing part of it." He explained that during the years in question, the department had been under intense pressure. Public scrutiny was high. Several high-profile cases had gone unsolved, and there was a growing fear of scandal. Closure, any kind of closure, became more important than truth. Files that resisted resolution were quietly deprioritized. Evidence that complicated narratives became inconvenient. Most people didn't notice, the man said, or didn't want to. It wasn't their job to ask questions. He confirmed that there had been rumors of a secondary storage location, unofficial and undocumented, a place where sensitive materials could be kept away from formal inventory. The ranger felt a familiar tightening in his chest as the description aligned perfectly with what he had seen beneath the forest floor. "Who knew about it?" he asked. The man shook his head. "Not many, and fewer still would admit it now." The conversation ended without names being spoken aloud, but the implication was clear. The ranger left with a sense that he was walking a narrowing path, one where each step forward would make it harder to turn back. Over the following days, he continued his work quietly. He requested access to old case files under the pretense of training review, careful to follow procedures closely enough to avoid suspicion. He cross-referenced reports, timelines, and witness statements. He noted where descriptions had changed subtly over time, where conclusions had been softened, where evidence lists had been revised. Again and again, the same signature appeared. He also returned to the forest. Officially, the site had been sealed. Unofficially, he still had access, and he used it sparingly. He did not enter the building again, but he studied the surrounding area with renewed focus. He traced the paths that led toward the structure, identifying places where vehicles could have approached without being seen. He found old tire impressions preserved beneath layers of leaf litter, consistent with repeated use over many years. He discovered something else as well. Not far from the building, concealed beneath a fallen log, he found a small metal object partially embedded in the soil. It was a key. Not a modern one, but the kind used for institutional locks. He did not remove it. He photographed it, marked the location, and left it where it was. Proof of access mattered more than possession. As his private investigation deepened, the resistance grew more tangible. Requests for information were delayed. Colleagues who had once been friendly grew cautious, their conversations shorter, their questions fewer. He began to sense that his name was being mentioned in rooms he was not invited into. Then came the warning. It arrived not as a threat, but as advice. A senior officer, someone he respected, pulled him aside after a briefing and spoke in a low voice. "You've done good work," the officer said, "but this isn't something you want to own. Let it go." The ranger met his eyes. "I can't." The officer sighed. "Just be careful. People don't like it when old things come back." That night, as he reviewed his notes once more, he realized that the question was no longer whether there had been wrongdoing. That much was clear. The real question was whether he could prove it in a way that would withstand scrutiny, or whether the truth would once again be softened into ambiguity. He decided, then, to take a risk. Using contacts he had built over years of interagency cooperation, he reached out beyond his immediate jurisdiction. He shared only what could not be ignored: the existence of unregistered evidence, the verified authenticity of the tag, the pattern of missing materials. He framed it not as an accusation, but as a request for independent review. The response came faster than he expected. An investigator from a higher-level office contacted him directly. Their tone was neutral, professional, but interested. They asked for documentation, for photographs, for timelines. They did not promise action, but they did not dismiss him either. For the first time since entering the observatory, he felt a cautious sense of momentum return. The following week, he was informed that a formal audit of several cold cases would be initiated. The announcement was brief, couched in bureaucratic language, but he recognized it for what it was: a crack in a wall that had stood for decades. As the process began, the ranger found himself increasingly isolated within his own department. He was reassigned to desk duties temporarily, a move explained as precautionary. He accepted it without complaint. Distance from the forest did not matter now. The trail he was following ran through records, memories, and carefully constructed silences. Late one evening, as he left the office, he noticed a car parked across the street that had not been there before. It remained as he drove away, its headlights dark. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it was coincidence. But the sense of being watched, of no longer being alone in his pursuit, settled over him like a second skin. He understood then that the discovery in the forest had not merely exposed hidden evidence. It had disrupted an old balance, one maintained by habit and denial. And those who had benefited from that balance would not welcome its collapse. The truth was moving now, slow but undeniable, and with it came consequences that he was only beginning to comprehend. The audit began quietly, announced in language so neutral it barely registered beyond official channels. To the public, it was framed as a routine review of archival procedures. Inside the system, however, it sent a tremor through departments that had grown comfortable with the past remaining where it was. Files that had not been opened in years were requested again. Old signatures resurfaced. Names long absent from daily conversation were spoken once more, cautiously, as if testing whether they still carried weight. For the ranger, the days took on a strange rhythm. Removed from field duty, he worked from a small office near the administrative wing, his access limited but not severed. He spent hours compiling timelines, organizing photographs, and cross-checking documents for the external investigators who now contacted him regularly. Everything he provided was factual, supported, carefully phrased. He had learned quickly that speculation, however justified, would only weaken the case. Yet, even within this structured process, the gaps remained glaring. The first batch of files returned from the archives confirmed what he had suspected. In case after case involving missing children, the documentation followed a familiar pattern. Initial reports were thorough. Search efforts were detailed. Witness interviews were logged meticulously. Then, abruptly, the trail thinned. Evidence inventories listed clothing, personal effects, sometimes backpacks or shoes, followed by a brief notation months later stating that physical items were no longer available. The reasons varied: storage damage, administrative error, loss during transfer. Different words, same result. When the ranger compared the dates, another pattern emerged. The disappearances clustered around specific years, specific regions, and specific investigative teams. Most striking of all was the repetition of a single name in the role of lead or supervising investigator. He did not need to say it aloud. The auditors saw it too. One afternoon, he was called into a secure conference room to answer questions directly. Two investigators sat across from him, both experienced, their expressions unreadable. They asked him to explain, in his own words, why the discovery in the forest mattered. He spoke slowly, grounding his explanation in the physical facts. The unregistered structure, the controlled environment, the careful preservation of items, the presence of an authentic evidence tag. He described the improbability of coincidence, the convergence of details that pointed toward intentional concealment rather than neglect. When he finished, one of the investigators leaned back and folded his arms. "Do you believe this was done by one person?" he asked. The ranger hesitated. "I believe it was done by someone with access," he said, "and with enough authority that no one stopped them." That answer seemed to satisfy them, at least for the moment. As the review expanded, resistance became more overt. Requests for additional files were delayed without explanation. Some documents arrived incomplete, with pages missing or sections redacted beyond necessity. The ranger documented every inconsistency, forwarding notes to the audit team. Each delay, each omission, only reinforced the sense that someone was still trying to manage the narrative. The retired archivist contacted him again, his tone more urgent than before. They met at the man's house, the same kitchen table between them, but the atmosphere had changed. There was no longer any pretense that the past could be discussed safely. "I should have said this earlier," the older man admitted, "but I didn't think anyone would listen." He explained that during the years in question there had been whispers of an informal arrangement. Certain cases, particularly those involving minors and unresolved outcomes, were considered liabilities. If physical evidence contradicted official conclusions or suggested investigative failures, it complicated matters. Rather than destroy such items outright, they were removed from circulation, stored somewhere secure, out of reach, until they could no longer cause problems. "People told themselves it was temporary," he said, "that the items would be returned once things settled. They never were." The ranger asked where this storage was supposed to be. The older man shook his head. "No one ever said it out loud," he replied, "but some places were mentioned. Old facilities, decommissioned sites, places no one went anymore." The forest once again rose unbidden in the ranger's mind. That same week, the audit team uncovered something that shifted the investigation from suspicion to substantiation. In one of the older case files, buried beneath routine correspondence, was a reference to an internal transfer of evidence to a temporary holding location. The destination was coded, the name abbreviated to a designation no longer in use. When cross-referenced with infrastructure records from the same period, the code aligned with a decommissioned research site, the Observatory. The finding was not announced. It was treated carefully, handled by a small circle of investigators, but the implication was undeniable. The building in the forest had not been chosen at random. It had been known, designated, and used. Pressure mounted quickly after that. The ranger noticed subtle changes in how people interacted with him. Conversations stopped when he entered a room. Emails went unanswered longer than before. His reassignment to desk duties was extended indefinitely. None of it was overtly hostile, but the message was clear. He was no longer merely inconvenient. He was a risk. One evening, as he left the office, he found a note tucked beneath the wiper of his car. There was no name, No signature, just a single sentence written in careful block letters. "You don't know who you're accusing." He stood there for several minutes, the paper trembling slightly in his hand. The message confirmed what he had already sensed. Someone was aware of how far the investigation had progressed. Someone felt threatened enough to reach out, yet cautious enough to avoid direct confrontation. He turned the note over to the audit team the next morning. They took it seriously, documenting it as potential intimidation. It added another layer to the case, one that suggested the concealment was not merely historical. Its consequences extended into the present. As the weeks passed, the focus narrowed. The repeated name in the files belonged to a former senior investigator who had retired with honors years earlier. Publicly, his reputation was impeccable. Privately, the records painted a more complicated picture. He had overseen multiple cases later marked by missing evidence. He had signed off on transfers during periods of administrative chaos. He had been involved in decisions that effectively halted investigations once physical proof was gone. The ranger was not asked to speculate about motive. That would come later. For now, the task was to establish opportunity and access. Those elements were easier to prove. Infrastructure logs showed that the former investigator had been part of a committee responsible for closing and repurposing old facilities. His signature appeared on documents authorizing the sealing of the observatory. Keys had been issued under his supervision. No record existed of their return. The implications settled heavily on the ranger. The story was no longer abstract. It had a face, a career, a history. Someone who had once sworn to protect evidence had instead hidden it, reshaping outcomes in ways that could not be undone. When the audit team finally requested permission to reopen the observatory site under full authority, the approval came swiftly. This time, the process was different. Uniformed officers secured the perimeter. Independent forensic specialists combed through the building from top to bottom. Every inch was documented. They found more than the ranger had seen during his initial discovery. Behind a false panel in one of the lower rooms, investigators uncovered a narrow compartment containing old envelopes and a small metal box. Inside were photocopies of reports, handwritten notes, and a set of keys labeled only with dates. Some notes referenced case numbers that matched the missing children files. Others contained brief, cryptic remarks that suggested internal disagreements, warnings that had been ignored. The observatory, it became clear, had served not only as a storage site, but as a kind of shadow archive, a place where inconvenient truths were set aside rather than confronted. When the ranger stood in the main chamber again, watching the team work under bright lights, the sense of unease was sharper than before. He was no longer standing in a forgotten building. He was standing inside a deliberate omission, a physical manifestation of decisions made behind closed doors. The audit was no longer a review, it was an investigation. And as its scope widened, it became increasingly difficult for anyone involved to pretend that the past could remain buried. By the time the investigation entered its next phase, the ranger no longer felt like an observer who had stumbled into something larger than himself. He had become part of its machinery, one of the visible points through which the past was being pulled into the present. The sense of inevitability was unmistakable now. Too many facts had aligned, too many documents had surfaced, and too many people were watching for the process to be quietly reversed. The work turned methodical. Under the direction of the independent investigators, the cases linked to the observatory were laid out side by side, not as isolated tragedies, but as elements of a single, expanding pattern. The ranger was asked to assist in organizing the information, not because he held authority over the cases, but because he understood the geography of the forest, the rhythms of the land, and the subtle ways in which human activity could be hidden within it. His role became that of a translator between terrain and record. He spent long hours in a secure room with walls of whiteboards and tables covered in folders. Maps of the region were pinned alongside timelines and photographs. Red lines traced routes from towns to trailheads, from trailheads to forest roads, from forest roads to the observatory. The more closely the data was examined, the more disturbing the consistency became. The disappearances had not occurred randomly. They clustered around access points that allowed someone to move unnoticed, parking areas with poor lighting, trail intersections where signage had changed over time, seasonal campsites that were unstaffed during certain months. Each location offered opportunity without drawing attention, especially to someone familiar with investigative procedures and search limitations. The ranger recognized the logic immediately. Whoever had orchestrated this concealment understood how searches were conducted, where resources were deployed, and when attention faded. It was not the thinking of a predator alone. It was the thinking of a professional. The former investigator's name appeared again and again, not just in the case files but in supporting documentation. He had authorized search terminations. He had recommended downgrading cases from active investigation to unresolved status. He had signed memos citing lack of evidence after the very evidence in question had been quietly removed from circulation. What made the situation even more unsettling was how ordinary it all appeared on the surface. The memos were polite, the language measured, the decisions framed as pragmatic. There was no hint of malice in the paperwork, only efficiency. That, perhaps, was the most chilling part. As the investigation progressed, the ranger was invited to accompany a team back to the observatory under full authority. This time, the building did not feel like a secret unearthed by chance. It felt like a crime scene finally being acknowledged for what it was. They moved through the structure slowly, documenting every surface, every modification. The ranger pointed out details that had stood out to him during his first entry: the clean cable cuts, the removed plaques, the newer bolts. Each detail was logged, photographed, and analyzed. What had once been intuitive impressions now became formal observations supported by expert testimony. Behind one of the false panels, investigators found something that shifted the tone of the operation. Tucked into a narrow cavity were several photographs, curled at the edges but still legible. They depicted the observatory interior years earlier, before the equipment had been removed. In one image, a man stood near the central platform, his back partially turned toward the camera. The ranger recognized him instantly. The former investigator's face was older in the photograph, his posture familiar from countless official portraits. The image was grainy, taken casually rather than formally, as though captured by someone with access rather than assignment. On the back of the photo was a date, written in pen, corresponding to a period when multiple cases had been quietly closed. The discovery was not announced publicly, but within the investigation team it marked a turning point. Access was no longer theoretical. Presence was documented. As preparations began for the next step, pressure intensified. News of the audit had leaked in vague terms, enough to spark speculation but not enough to inform. Journalists began calling the ranger's office seeking comment. He was instructed not to speak to the media, a directive he followed without complaint. Silence, at this stage, was protection as much as it was policy. Privately, however, the strain grew. He received anonymous messages that were carefully worded, never explicit enough to qualify as threats. Warnings disguised as concern. Reminders of reputations of families, of the consequences of misunderstanding events from decades past. Each message reinforced the same idea, that reopening these cases would not bring clarity, only chaos. He reported every contact, every message, documenting them as meticulously as he had documented the observatory itself. The investigation team assured him that such pressure was expected. It meant progress was being made. One of the most difficult moments came when families of the missing were contacted as a part of the reopened inquiries. The ranger was not present for most of those conversations, but he was briefed afterward. He heard about tears held back for years, finally released, about anger that had nowhere to go, about relief tangled painfully with grief. For some families, the knowledge that their loved ones' belongings had been preserved, even in secret, was both comfort and betrayal. The ranger felt the weight of those reactions keenly. These were not abstract outcomes. They were the human cost of administrative decisions made long ago, decisions that had favored closure over truth. As evidence accumulated, the investigators prepared to confront the former investigator directly. The ranger was informed of the plan, but not included in the interview itself. His role, they explained, had already been fulfilled. He had opened the door. Others would now walk through it. On the morning of the interview, the ranger found himself unable to focus on routine tasks. He paced the length of his office, listening to the muffled sounds of activity beyond the door. Somewhere else, not far away, a man who had shaped dozens of investigations was being asked to account for choices he had made when no one was watching. The outcome of that interview would shape everything that followed. The call came late in the afternoon. The former investigator had denied wrongdoing, as expected. He claimed administrative necessity, blamed outdated systems, fires, and clerical errors. But when confronted with the photographs from the observatory and the documentation of key access, his responses had grown less certain. He admitted to knowing about the site. He admitted to authorizing its use for temporary storage. He insisted it had been intended as a safeguard, not a concealment. The investigators were not persuaded. Shortly after the interview, surveillance units reported unusual activity near the observatory. Someone had attempted to approach the site after hours, only to turn away upon encountering security. The timing was too precise to ignore. It suggested that someone had hoped to remove or alter whatever remained. The ranger returned to the forest that evening, standing at a distance while officers maintained watch. The dome was visible through the trees, illuminated by controlled lighting, no longer hidden. For the first time, the structure was part of the landscape in an official sense. It was no longer a secret. He thought about how close it had come to remaining that way. As night fell, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and resolve. The truth was no longer fragile. It had weight now, momentum. Whatever happened next, it would not be erased quietly. The forest, unchanged in its rhythms, bore witness without judgment. And beneath its canopy, the long-concealed connection between one man and dozens of vanished lives had finally been brought into the open, where it could no longer be ignored. The forest was quieter than it had ever been, or perhaps the ranger simply noticed its silence now in a different way. In the days that followed the confrontation, the observatory became a fixed point in an expanding circle of consequences. What had begun as a chance discovery during a routine patrol had grown into something that reached far beyond the trees, beyond the boundaries of the park, and beyond the years that many had assumed were safely sealed away. The former investigator was placed under formal scrutiny almost immediately after the interview. There were no dramatic arrests, no public spectacle. Instead, there were subpoenas, sealed court filings, and long hours of testimony conducted behind closed doors. The careful pace of the process frustrated some, but the ranger understood the necessity. This was not a case that could withstand haste. It required precision, patience, and an unbroken chain of proof. The search of the man's home was conducted early one morning. The ranger was not present, but he was briefed afterward in detail. Investigators moved methodically through the house, room by room, cataloging documents, storage boxes, and locked cabinets. The basement yielded the most significant findings. There, behind shelves of old files and personal memorabilia, they discovered containers similar to those found in the observatory. Inside were additional items bearing the same type of evidence tags, their numbers corresponding to cases long marked as incomplete or unsolvable. There were also notebooks, not diaries in the personal sense, but working journals filled with dates, case references, and short annotations. Some entries were clinical, others almost defensive in tone, as if written to justify decisions to an unseen audience. Together, they formed a record of intent that could no longer be explained away as accident or oversight. As these discoveries were processed, the official narrative shifted. What had initially been framed as an audit evolved into a criminal investigation focused on obstruction of justice, abuse of authority, and evidence tampering. Additional names surfaced, not as primary actors, but as individuals who had looked away, signed forms without question, or accepted explanations that should have been challenged. Accountability, it became clear, would not be limited to a single person. The observatory itself was formally designated as a secured site connected to an active investigation. Its status changed in the records, gaining an identity it had been denied for decades. Engineers assessed its structural integrity. Historians examined its origins, and forensic teams completed exhaustive sweeps of every room. Nothing else of evidentiary value was found, but the absence itself told a story. The building had been used precisely as long as it was needed, and no longer. For the families of the missing, the weeks that followed were among the most difficult they had endured. Notifications were delivered carefully, with counselors present, each conversation tailored to the specific circumstances of the case. Some families learned for the first time that their child's belongings had been recovered years earlier, preserved in secret rather than lost. The knowledge brought mixed emotions. Relief that something tangible remained, anger that it had been withheld, grief reopened by the confirmation that the search had been compromised. The ranger attended one of the briefings, seated quietly at the back of the room. He listened as officials explained the findings, the steps being taken, and the limits of what could be promised. He watched the faces of parents who had grown older in the long wait for answers, their expressions a blend of hope and resignation. He understood then that no outcome, however thorough, could restore what had been taken. At best, it could offer clarity where there had been silence. Several cases were formally reopened. Advances in forensic science allowed for analyses that had not been possible when the children first disappeared. Items retrieved from the observatory and the investigator's home were processed with modern techniques, their potential carefully evaluated. In a few instances, results emerged that reshaped long-held assumptions. Leads were identified. Timelines adjusted. In one case, a determination was made that allowed a family to finally move forward with certainty rather than doubt. The ranger followed these developments closely, though he remained on the periphery. His role had shifted again, this time from catalyst to witness. He provided statements when asked, clarified details about the discovery, and assisted with geographical analysis when needed. Otherwise, he returned gradually to his duties, the forest reclaiming its place as his primary responsibility. His standing within the department changed in subtle ways. Some colleagues treated him with quiet respect, others with guarded distance. He understood both reactions. What he had uncovered challenged not only an individual, but a culture that had allowed convenience to overshadow responsibility. That kind of disruption rarely left relationships untouched. One afternoon, months after the initial discovery, he was called back to the observatory site. The investigation there had concluded, and officials were preparing to transfer control of the land back to the Park Service. Before that happened, they wanted him to see the place one last time. The building looked smaller than he remembered, stripped now of its secrets and its mystery. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the trees, casting patterns across the dome's weathered surface. Inside, the rooms were empty, their walls marked only by the faint shadows of what had once been stored there. The silence felt different, no longer oppressive but resolute. He stood in the narrow storage room where he had first seen the backpacks. It was clean now, swept and documented, its purpose fulfilled. He imagined the space as it had been before, heavy with the weight of what it concealed, and felt a quiet sense of closure. Before leaving, he walked the perimeter alone. The forest, indifferent as ever, had already begun to reclaim the disturbed ground. Leaves covered old tracks, new growth pushed up through compacted soil. Time, relentless and impartial, moved forward. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings continued. Some outcomes were public, others sealed. The former investigator was held accountable through the system he had once navigated with ease. Institutional reforms were announced, new safeguards implemented, protocols revised. Whether these changes would prevent similar abuses in the future remained to be seen, but their necessity was no longer in question. The ranger received a letter near the end of the year. It came from one of the families, brief and handwritten. There were no accusations in it, no demands. Only gratitude for having noticed something others had overlooked, and for refusing to walk away when it would have been easier to do so. He read it once, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer at home. On a clear autumn morning, he resumed a familiar patrol route, passing through the same sector where the storm had first led him astray. The forest looked unchanged, yet he knew it was not. Neither was he. He paused near the spot where he had first glimpsed the curve of metal through the leaves. The observatory was no longer hidden, but it was no longer a threat either. It had become part of the land's history, a reminder of how easily truths could be buried, and how difficult it was to unearth them once they were. As he continued on, the forest closed around him, the path stretching ahead in quiet continuity. The story that had begun beneath the trees would be told and retold in files, in courtrooms, and in the memories of those it had touched. His part in it was finished, but its meaning would endure. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important discoveries were not those that revealed something new, but those that forced the past to finally be seen for what it was. If this story made you stop and think, subscribe to the channel. More real investigations and hidden stories are coming next. Watch the next video to see what else was found, and what was kept silent for years. Share this video so others can see what was hidden.